Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today's question was suggested by a viewer, thanks to Coffee SGR for this one. Amy taps a plains and says exile your Arbor Elf, while discarding a Prismatic end. Nick exiles the Arbor Elf, but then searches his library for a forest and puts it onto the battlefield tapped. He then shuffles and presents his deck to Amy for a cut, which she does. After Nick draws his card for the turn, Amy says, "Hey, wait a minute, where's your fetch land?" At this point, she calls for a judge. During your interviews with the players, you find out that Nick thought that Amy had played Path to Exile, so he searched his library for a forest. For her part, Amy thought that Nick was cracking a fetch land during the end of her turn, and that's why he was searching his library for that forest. She only noticed, to the contrary, after Nick drew his card for the turn, when she looked at Nick's graveyard and didn't see any fetches there. So, what is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? I really like this question for a few reasons. First, it's really interesting and there's a lot of stuff going on. Second, even with all that, it has a rather elegant and extremely satisfying solution. And finally, the relevance of this type of question is at an all-time high. With the number of different card arts that Magic cards are getting these days, it's extremely believable that someone might see an unfamiliar one and mistake it for a different removal spell which has the same mana cost. So, let's take a look at how we would resolve this. The first thing that we want to look at is the first action that either player took, which was against the rules. That's what the infraction is based off of. It doesn't matter whether the player thought what they were doing was within the rules, it only matters whether it actually was or was not. So, looking at things from this lens, you can identify that the first time someone did something against the rules was when Nick searched his library for that forest. That was not an action that he was enabled to take by any game instructions. So, that's the first thing that he did, which was against the rules. Now we have to look in Magic's policy documents and see what the correct infraction is based on someone doing that action. Now, you could maybe make a case for this being a looking at extra cards. However, I would say that because the looking for a forest is part of the same game action as the looking at your library, I would think that this falls better under a game rule violation. Now, if we have that, then that means that Nick would be getting a warning, and Amy would also be getting a warning for failure to maintain game state. Now we'll get to the fix, which is also a really kind of interesting situation. First of all, there's a partial fix that looks like it might be kind of promising. If a card is in the wrong zone after a zone change, then we can just put it back into the correct zone, if we can do so with minimal disruption to the game state. Now, we can probably move that forest back into Nick's library with minimal disruption to the game state. However, this partial fix isn't really applicable here. The way it's worded, it actually applies to stuff where a card is supposed to be changing zones and either doesn't or gets put into the wrong zone during that process. Now, the forest was not supposed to be changing zones at all, and that means that the situation that we have here doesn't exactly match the situation that we would need to have in order to apply this partial fix. That means that our actions are to either leave the game state as is or to back up. I think that most judges would agree that backing up here is the fix that gets us the closest to what the game state would look like if there was no error. Now, what would we have to do that? So, Nick has drawn a card, which means that we would have to take a random card from his hand and put it on top of his library. Then, we would retap his permanents, if any, and put the forest back into his library and shuffle it in. If you are a really big stickler for the rules, I think you would probably have Nick shuffle the card that he had put on top of his library and draw a new card at the beginning of his turn. However, I feel like this is probably not the way I would want to go if I was the head judge. I would have him take the card that he put on top of his library and not shuffle that one, since we already know what its identity was supposed to be, and have Nick just redraw that one at the start of his turn. The downside to this is that Nick would have possibly been able to draw that forest for his turn, and so we are kind of disrupting the game state a little bit there. However, I feel like the alternate where Nick takes a random card out of his hand, which he might have needed and made decisions based on having, and loses it, is more disruptive to the overall state of the game. However, this is something that the head judge would probably need to get involved in to decide. Before I sign off, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the fix would be if this happened at regular rel. Ordinarily, what I like to do is take a look at what the fix is at competitive and see how well I think it fits. If I think it fits well, then I won't change anything and do the same exact fix. However, if I think something could be improved in the specific situation, then I'll modify the competitive fix as appropriate. In this case, I already said that I was pretty satisfied with how this one turned out. However, I think it might be even cleaner if Nick would just take the forest and shuffle it back in. In other words, doing the partial fix that we kind of hoped we would be able to do at the beginning. I think that this is the cleanest way to resolve this situation, and the fact that Nick doesn't have that forest in his deck when he's drawing a card for the turn is unideal, but certainly minor and something that I would be prepared to live with. And that's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.